In November of 1955, a farmer in western Pennsylvania knelt down at the base of a cliff and reached into a hole in the dirt. 12 inches down, burnt bone. He kept going. 2.5 feet under that hillside, his hand closed on a flint knife. Whole, not a fragment, not a chip. A complete tool lying in the dark exactly where somebody had left it. Then he did something almost nobody does. He put it back. He pushed the dirt in with his hands until the hole was gone, and he stood up and he walked back to his house, and he told nobody. He kept it that way for 18 years. Underneath that patch of dirt was a fire pit that had gone cold while an ice sheet a mile thick was still sitting on Canada. And for the next 50 years, American archaeology would go to war over whether that was even possible. The man who buried it knew none of that. He only knew he had found something, and that the moment anyone else heard about it, it would be gone. His name was Albert Miller. His family had farmed that land since 1795. Hundreds of acres of rolling country outside the village of Avella in Washington County, about an hour southwest of Pittsburgh. At the edge of the property, above a stream called Cross Creek, there was a sandstone overhang, a natural stone awning cut back into the hillside by the water over thousands of years. Today, that overhang is called Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, and it is a National Historic Landmark. In 1955, it was a place where Albert Miller's cattle went to get out of the rain. Miller knew enough local history to know what a rock shelter was and what it was for. He had always suspected people had camped under that one. On the 12th of November, he watched a groundhog disappear into a burrow at the base of it, and he went to look at what the animal had thrown out behind it. Along with the knife came flint flakes, freshwater mussel shells, and burnt bone. Somebody had sat under that overhang and cooked a meal. And that is the reason he filled the hole back in. Because Miller understood something that most people who find a piece of the past do not. The object is not the discovery. Where it was sitting is the discovery. Pull a knife out of the ground, and you have a knife. Leave it where it is, record the layer it came from and what was lying beside it, and you have a date and a sequence and an argument. He was not protecting the artifact, he was protecting the dirt around it. He had no idea that the hole he was filling in would end up on the front page of the Washington Post, or that it would take 50 years and a plane full of his own critics flying to South America before anyone admitted he had been right. So he waited. He spent 14 years looking for a professional he could trust, writing letters, asking around, getting nowhere. 18 years in total from the day he found it to the day the first trowel went in. I want to stop on that because I have thought about it more than anything else in this story. 18 years of knowing you are standing on something and saying nothing, not out of secrecy, out of fear that the wrong person with a shovel would erase it in a weekend. In the spring of 1973, a 29-year-old new faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh named James Adavasio was looking for somewhere to run a student field school. A local historian mentioned a farmer with a rock shelter. Nobody expected anything. Field schools are teaching exercises. Students learn how to hold a trowel and how to keep a notebook. The dig opened on the 18th of June. Then the students kept going down. The deposits under that overhang were not a few feet deep. They were layered like the pages of a book, one occupation stacked on another, and every layer they lifted carried them further back. Before it was finished, the excavation recovered more than 20,000 artifacts, about 150 separate fire pits, close to 1 million animal bones, and 52 radiocarbon dates running in almost perfect order. Oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. 52. Sit with what that means for a moment. If anything had disturbed those layers, if water had moved through, if animals had churned it, if anything at all had been mixed, those dates would come back scrambled. They did not. They came back stacked like a staircase. And the bottom of that staircase was 16,000 years old. They also found a spear point down there, slender and unfluted, matching nothing in the Clovis toolkit. They named it the Miller Lanceolate after the farmer. When I first went through that sequence, I assumed it was the end of the argument. 52 dates in order, a tool type nobody had seen before, a fire pit older than the rule book allowed. It was not the end. It was barely the beginning. Because in 1974, the numbers made the front page of the Washington Post. And at that moment, every textbook in America agreed on one thing. The first people to reach this continent were the Clovis hunters, who arrived roughly 13,000 years ago carrying a distinctive fluted spear point. That was not a theory. That was the rule. And the charcoal from the bottom of Albert Miller's hole was 3,000 years older. The response was led by a geologist named Vance Haynes, and I have to be fair to him here because his objection was not stupid, and it was not personal. He never accused anyone of lying. He said something worse than that. He said the ground itself had lied to them. Western Pennsylvania is coal country. Coal is carbon so ancient that it contains no measurable radiocarbon at all. If even a trace of it had washed into those charcoal samples through groundwater, every date at the bottom of that hole would come back far older than the truth. Not by a little, by thousands of years. And then came the second objection, and it was worse. If people were sitting under that overhang 16,000 years ago, they were camped about 50 miles from the edge of an ice sheet a mile thick. The plants and animals around their fire should have been tundra. Spruce, caribou, mammoth. They were not. The bones and the wood were white-tailed deer, squirrel, oak, hickory. A temperate forest. The wrong world entirely, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Adovazio spent the next 30 years answering, and he answered the coal charge twice. First, he sent the samples somewhere better. Oxford Accelerator Mass Spectrometry, a method that did not exist in 1974. If ancient coal carbon was sitting in those samples, a more precise machine would find it. The old dates held. Second, he went looking for the water, because contamination needs a delivery system. Somebody has to carry that coal carbon down into the deposit, and the only thing that does that is groundwater moving through the sediment. An independent specialist examined it and found no sign that water had ever moved through. The critics came back on the chemistry of the charcoal itself. The argument never fully closed. And that is the quiet part of this story. Nobody ever demonstrated that coal carbon got into those samples. Nobody had to. The charge only had to be repeated, calmly and often, for long enough to keep the site at arm's length. That is not fraud, and it is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary than that. You do not have to disprove an inconvenient site. You only have to leave a question mark on it and let the doubt do the work. And then Adovazio did something strange for a man being accused of overreaching. He claimed less. In 1990, he and his colleagues published a chronology arguing only that people were present in southwestern Pennsylvania by 14 to 14,500 years ago. Not an outrageous number, just an impossible one under the rules of the time. He was holding the most explosive site in the country, and he deliberately asked for less than his own evidence allowed. That is not what somebody does when they are chasing a headline. Then the rules changed. In January of 1997, a group of the field's most senior specialists flew to a waterlogged site in southern Chile called Monte Verde, examined it with their own hands, and publicly conceded that it was older than Clovis. Two names on that delegation matter here. One was James Adovazio, the other was Vance Haynes. The man who had spent a quarter of a century arguing that Meadowcroft's dates could not be trusted got on a plane, looked at somebody else's evidence, and put his name to the consensus that ended Clovis First. The wall came down, and once it was down, the evidence stacked up fast. In a dried lake bed in New Mexico, human footprints have been dated by multiple independent methods to more than 20,000 years ago, and they have survived every round of testing thrown at them since. Meadowcroft was not the outlier anymore. The discipline had simply taken 50 years to walk to the spot where a E.A. Pennsylvania farmer had been standing since 1955. In 2005, the shelter Albert Miller filled back in was named a National Historic Landmark. You can visit it. You can stand on a platform above the excavation and look straight down into the hole. The groundhog got a name too. The staff call him Rocky, an animal who dug into one of the oldest human sites in North America, threw the evidence out behind him, and wandered off without ever knowing what he had done. What stays with me is not the dates. It is that the whole thing turned on a man who decided that waiting 18 years was better than losing it, and on an animal that had no idea what it was doing. And Albert Miller was not a specialist. He was a farmer who paid attention to his own land. There are rock shelters like that all over the Appalachians. There are creek banks and plowed fields and road cuts in every state watching this. Most of them have never been looked at by anyone with a notebook. Somewhere under a pasture, under a driveway, under somebody's back garden, the next one is sitting there waiting for something to dig in exactly the right place. So tell me which one you would have been. The man who fills the hole back in and waits 18 years for someone he can trust. Or the man who picks up the phone that afternoon and takes his chances. And then the harder question, which is the one I keep coming back to. Vance Haynes never proved contamination at Meadowcroft. He raised the possibility, and the possibility held that site at arm's length for decades. Was that science doing its job properly, or was that gatekeeping wearing a lab coat? I go back and forth on it, and I do not think the answer is obvious. Tell me where you land, and subscribe if you want more of these, because there are a lot of them, and I am working through them one at a time. One last thing, if you have found something on your own land, a point, a flake, a piece of pottery turned up in a plowed field, I want to hear about it. Tell me the county. Thanks for watching.